"That fence is a violation, and it's coming down, or I'll make sure you lose this house." The voice was as sharp and unpleasant as gravel in a gearbox, and it belonged to a woman who seemed to be the physical embodiment of a poorly managed homeowners association. Her name was Karen Miller, president of the Harmony Creek Estates HOA, and she stood on the edge of my property line with her arms crossed. A floral muumuu stretched taut over a frame that suggested a deep and abiding passion for judging others and eating Bundt cake. Her eyes, small and hard, raked over the beautiful 6-foot cedar fence my son-in-law and I had just spent the last 3 weekends installing. Behind me, inside the house, my German Shepherd, General, let out a low growl, sensing the acrid hostility radiating from this woman. The fence was for him, a rescue I'd taken in who served as my unofficial service animal. His steady presence a balm on the frayed nerves left over from 3 tours overseas. He needed room to run, and I needed the peace of mind that he was secure. Karen held a clipboard like a weapon, and with a flourish of theatrical indignation, she tore a sheet from it and thrust it at me. "This is your first and only warning, Mr. Thorne. Article 4, Section 2B of the Harmony Creek Covenants. Fencing on properties adjacent to the community greenbelt shall not exceed 5 feet in height. Yours is 6. That's a level 3 violation. The fine is $1,000, doubling every 7 days you remain in noncompliance, up to a maximum of $50,000, at which point we will place a lien on your property and begin foreclosure proceedings. You have 1 week to tear it down." This is the part where my quiet retirement went straight to hell. If you've ever been on the receiving end of a power-drunk bureaucrat on a mission, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and if you've got your own HOA nightmare story, because I have a feeling this is going to resonate. Now, let me tell you how I took a $50,000 fine and turned it into the complete and utter dismantling of Karen Miller's petty kingdom. My property wasn't even technically in Harmony Creek Estates. I was an outlier, an older 5-acre plot that the developers had been forced to build around when my predecessor, an old farmer named Jed, refused to sell. I'd bought it for the space and the quiet, a buffer against the cookie-cutter beige world that had sprung up around it. But when I closed on the property, my lawyer had pointed out a pesky little rider in the deed, an architectural oversight agreement Jed had signed years ago in exchange for the county paving his access road. It gave the Harmony Creek HOA, an entity that didn't even exist at the time, limited aesthetic control over any permanent structures visible from their common areas. It was vague, legally dubious, and had never been tested. Until now. I looked from the professionally printed, grossly intimidating violation notice to Karen's smug face, a mask of self-righteousness. She was enjoying this. The power, the confrontation, the chance to bring someone to heel. I'd seen that look before, on the faces of tin-pot dictators and overzealous second lieutenants who got a thrill from wielding authority they hadn't truly earned. I folded the paper calmly, my movements deliberate and slow, the way my drill sergeant had taught me to handle a weapon that could misfire. "Ms. Miller," I said, my voice even and low, "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I will review my deed and the associated covenants and will respond to the board in writing." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She had expected shouting, pleading, or immediate, fearful compliance. She had not expected calm procedure. "There's nothing to review," she snapped, recovering quickly. "The rules are the rules. 1 week, Mr. Thorne. The clock is ticking." She turned on her heel and marched back toward the pristine sidewalk of her beige kingdom, her muumuu fluttering behind her like a battle standard. I stood there for a long moment, the scent of fresh-cut cedar filling the air, a scent of honest work and peaceful intentions. But now it was tainted with the stink of conflict. I looked at the solid, well-built fence, a line I had drawn to protect my peace, and I realized it had just become a battlefront. I went inside, General resting his heavy head on my knee, and I spread the fine, the HOA bylaws, and my property deed across my old oak desk. The oversight clause was just as I remembered. A single, poorly worded paragraph about maintaining community aesthetic harmony. It was an attorney's playground, an invitation to argue. The violation notice itself was a masterpiece of intimidation. full of bold-faced caps and threatening legal jargon clearly designed to terrify the average homeowner into submission. But I wasn't the average homeowner. For 25 years in the Army, I'd dealt with complex regulations, navigated Byzantine bureaucracies, and learned that the person who knows the rules better than their opponent is the person who wins. And for the last 5 years, since retiring from the service, I'd been sitting on the other side of the bench. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I'm a county judge, the very county where Harmony Creek Estates was located. And Karen Miller had just made the monumental mistake of trying to bully the man whose signature was required on every major land use permit her precious HOA would ever file. She just didn't know it yet. The first step in any engagement is reconnaissance. You don't fire until you know the target, the terrain, and what assets the enemy possesses. Karen Miller had fired a shot across my bow, and now it was my turn to survey the battlefield. I spent the next 2 days not in anger, but in methodical, meticulous preparation. My oak desk became my command center. I had the HOA covenants, which I'd obtained during my property closing, and I read them cover to cover. Not just the section on fences, but every article, every bylaw, every addendum. It was a fascinating document, a portrait of a control freak's paradise. There were regulations on the precise shade of beige your house could be painted, the maximum height of grass allowed, 25 inches, measured weekly, the approved species of mailbox-adjacent shrubbery, and a truly bewildering section on the moral and aesthetic suitability of holiday decorations. It was a charter for a petty tyrant, and Karen Miller was clearly born to rule it. The fine she had levied was, as I suspected, legally questionable. The escalating structure was designed for maximum psychological impact, but it likely wouldn't hold up in court without a clear, undisputed contractual basis. The lien threat was real, but it was a long and expensive process for the HOA to actually execute, one they likely used as a bluff. My next move had to be precise. Couldn't be emotional. It had to be a clear, legal signal that I was not an easy target. I drafted a letter. Not an angry email, but a formal, certified letter addressed to the HOA Board of Directors, care of Karen Miller, President. My old friend Dave Sterling, who'd been my right hand in the JAG Corps and was now in private practice, gave it a once-over. "It's perfect, Marcus," he said over the phone. "Polite, firm, and you've seeded it with enough legal terminology to make their heads spin. You're questioning their jurisdiction, the validity of the fine, the legality of the enforcement process, and requesting a formal hearing. You've also requested copies of the board meeting minutes where this fine structure was approved. That'll send them scrambling." I sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested. The green card, signed by Karen herself, came back 4 days later. A small, tactical victory. I had proof they had received my official challenge. While I waited for their response, I started my ground-level intel gathering. I began taking my walks with General not around my own acreage, but through the winding, unervingly identical streets of Harmony Creek Estates. I was just a neighbor walking his dog. I smiled at everyone. I was polite, unassuming. I learned that the community was divided into 2 camps. Those who loved Karen's iron-fisted rule because it kept property values high and the lawns immaculate, and those who lived in quiet terror of her. It was the second group I was interested in. I struck up a conversation with an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, who was furtively watering a small patch of non-approved petunias, hidden behind a large, HOA-compliant boxwood. Her hands trembled as she spoke about Karen. "She made me rip out my roses," she whispered, her eyes darting around as if Karen might materialize from the bushes. "Said they were a thorny hazard, and not on the approved flora list. My husband planted those for me before he passed." My next conversation was with a young couple, the Garcias, who were pushing a stroller. They looked exhausted. They told me about the $5,000 in fines they'd racked up because the color of their toddler's plastic slide was Baja Blue, instead of the pre-approved Coastal Mist. "We had to take out a loan," Mr. Garcia said, his voice a mixture of shame and fury. "She told us if we fought it, she'd make our lives a living hell." A pattern was emerging. This wasn't about maintaining community standards. It was about power, control, and, I suspected, profit. Where did all this fine money go? I was starting to think this wasn't just about my fence anymore. This was about a community held hostage. The official response from the HOA arrived a week later. It was a single sheet of paper, a letter dripping with condescension, signed by Karen. It stated that their legal counsel had reviewed my letter and found it without merit. They denied my request for the meeting minutes. Claiming they were internal board documents, they acknowledged my request for a hearing, which they scheduled for the following Tuesday in the community clubhouse. The letter ended with a smug reminder. Please be advised that your fine has now doubled to $2,000. We look forward to resolving this at the hearing. They were doubling down. They thought I was just another homeowner they could steamroll in their kangaroo court. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I marked the hearing on my calendar. Phase 1 was complete. I had established a paper trail, identified the pattern of abuse, and begun to find potential allies. Now it was time for Phase 2, a direct confrontation in their chosen arena. I was going to walk into that hearing not just as a homeowner, but as an officer of the court, ready to observe and document every procedural flaw they committed. They wanted a war of paperwork and procedure. They were about to find out they'd picked a fight with a grandmaster. The Harmony Creek Estates clubhouse smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade air freshener, a scent I immediately associated with bureaucratic stagnation. The room was set up like a courtroom, but a cheap imitation. A long folding table at the front served as the bench, and behind it sat the tribunal. Karen Miller, flanked by 2 other board members. One was a thin, nervous-looking man named Barry, who avoided eye contact with everyone. The other was a woman named Sheila, whose expression of pursed-lipped judgment mirrored Karen's perfectly. They were the queen and her court. A handful of other residents were scattered in the folding chairs, their presence mandated for some other minor infraction. A misplaced garden gnome, perhaps, or an unapproved welcome mat. They all looked miserable. I took a seat in the front row, placed a small, discreet digital audio recorder on the table in front of me, and pressed record. It was my legal right in this state to record any conversation I was a party to, and this hearing certainly qualified. Karen's eyes narrowed when she saw the device, but she said nothing. A small crack in her composure. The board now calls the matter of the violation at 1120 Old Farm Road, property of Mr. Marcus Thorne, she announced, her voice echoing slightly in the sparsely populated room. Mr. Thorne, you are here to appeal a Level 3 violation regarding unapproved fencing. I stood up. For the record, my name is Marcus Thorne, and for the record, I am not here to appeal. I am here to contest the very basis of the violation and the jurisdiction of this board over my property. A murmur went through the small audience. This was not the usual script of apologies and pleas for leniency. Karen's face tightened. Your property is subject to the architectural oversight agreement in your deed, as you well know. We have reviewed it. Our authority is clear. My legal counsel disagrees, I stated calmly. The language is ambiguous and likely unenforceable. But that is a matter for another time and another venue. For today, I am here because my certified letter requested specific documentation which you have failed to provide. Specifically, the board meeting minutes where the fine structure you are attempting to levy was voted on and approved. Sheila, the other board member, spoke up for the first time. As we stated in our letter, board minutes are internal documents, actually, I countered, pulling a folded copy of the state's Property Owners Association Act from my jacket pocket. According to state law, all homeowners in an association, or those contractually bound to it, as you claim I am, have the right to inspect the association's books, records, and minutes of all meetings of its board. Your refusal to provide them is, in itself, a violation of state law. The room went silent. Barry, the nervous man, began shuffling his papers, his Adam's apple bobbing. Karen shot him a look that could curdle milk. We are not here to debate state law, Mr. Thorne. We are here to discuss your fence. My fence is 6 feet tall to ensure the security of my service animal, which is a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act, I said, dropping another legal bomb into the proceedings. I didn't need the accommodation, as General wasn't a formally certified service animal. But the mere mention of the FHA was enough to put the fear of federal litigation into any board. However, I continued, pressing the advantage, I am more than willing to discuss the fence. provided this hearing is conducted with proper due process. You have presented no evidence, no dated photographs of the violation, no official measurements. You have simply made an accusation and attached a punitive and likely illegal fine to it. Where is your evidence? Karen was turning a dangerous shade of red. She had expected a supplicant, and instead she got a procedural expert who was calmly dismantling her authority, piece by piece, in front of an audience. The evidence is the fence. We can all see it, she sputtered. Then I'd like to formally request that the board conduct an official site visit with a licensed surveyor to measure the fence in question and provide a certified report. I'd also like to cross-examine the individual who made the initial report of the violation. I knew, of course, that the individual was Karen herself. I was forcing her to become a witness in her own tribunal. This was all for the recording. Every request I made was reasonable and legally sound. Every denial from her would be another nail in the coffin I was building for her. This is ridiculous. Karen slammed her hand on the folding table, rattling a pitcher of water. We are not a court of law. Then you cannot levy fines and threaten to place liens on my property as if you are. I shot back, my voice still level, but with a new edge of steel. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot wield the power of a quasi-governmental body without adhering to the basic principles of due process that govern such bodies. You have failed to provide documentation, failed to present evidence, and are conducting a hearing where the accuser is also the judge. This entire proceeding is a farce. I let that hang in the air. The other residents were now sitting up, watching with wide eyes. I had given voice to something they had all likely felt but were too intimidated to say. Karen looked at Sheila, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. They were losing control. But Karen's ego was too big to allow for a strategic retreat. She leaned into the microphone. The board has heard your points, Mr. Thorne. We find them to be without merit. The violation is upheld. The fine, which now stands at $4,000, is due within 30 days. If you fail to comply, we will proceed as outlined in the initial notice. This hearing is adjourned. She slammed a cheap wooden gavel on the table. It was over. I hadn't won the appeal, but I had won something far more important. I had it all on tape. Their denial of state law, their lack of due process, their utter disregard for fairness. I calmly stopped the recording, stood up, and looked directly at Karen. Thank you for your time, I said. And thank you for providing me with all the evidence I will need. I turned and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving behind a stunned silence and the palpable fury of a petty tyrant who had just been publicly outmaneuvered. The battle was far from over, but I had secured the high ground. Now it was time to bring in the heavy artillery. The walk home from the clubhouse was different. The beige houses and manicured lawns of Harmony Creek no longer looked merely sterile. They looked like a Potemkin village, a pleasant facade hiding a foundation of rot and fear. My fence, standing tall and proud at the edge of my property, looked less like a boundary and more like a declaration of independence. The recording of the hearing was exactly what I'd hoped for. A crystal-clear document of Karen Miller's procedural abuses. I sent a copy to Dave Sterling, my old JAG Corps buddy. He called me back within the hour, a low whistle on his end of the line. Marcus, this is gold, he said. Pure, unadulterated legal gold. They broke about half a dozen state statutes in a 20-minute meeting. The refusal to provide minutes, the lack of evidence, the commingling of the roles of accuser and judge. A first-year law student could drive a truck through the holes in their process. This isn't just a defense against their fine anymore. This is a potential lawsuit. That was precisely what I was thinking. But a lawsuit would be my final move, the checkmate. I still needed to arrange the other pieces on the board. My next step was to move from anecdotal evidence, Mrs. Gable's roses, the Garcia slide, to hard data. As a judge, I had a deep and abiding respect for the power of public records. They are the great equalizer, the place where secrets go to die. I spent the next week at the county clerk's office and online, pulling every document I could find related to the Harmony Creek Estates HOA. I started with their incorporation papers, their annual reports, their tax filings. Standard, boring stuff for the most part. But then I started cross-referencing names. I pulled the vendor contracts the HOA had on file with the county. A recurring name popped up for all major landscaping and property maintenance work. Miller's Pristine Lawns and Landscaping. A quick search of state business records revealed the owner, Daniel Miller, Karen Miller's brother-in-law. Every time Karen forced a homeowner to rip out non-compliant shrubbery or resod a lawn that had turned a shade too brown, her own family was getting the contract to do the replacement work, at rates that seemed suspiciously high. This was more than just a conflict of interest. It was a potential kickback scheme, funded by the fines and fees she extorted from her neighbors. The picture was getting darker and clearer. Next, I dived into property records and court filings. I searched for liens filed by the Harmony Creek HOA. There were dozens over the past 5 years, far more than was typical for a community of its size. I traced each one. Many were settled, with homeowners likely paying the exorbitant fines to avoid a legal battle. But I found 3 instances where the HOA had successfully foreclosed on a home. In each case, the property was then sold at auction for a price well below market value. And in each of those 3 cases, the buyer was the same entity, a shell corporation called Evergreen Development Group, more digging. The registered agent for Evergreen Development Group was an attorney at a downtown law firm. A few more searches in the State Bar Association directory and I found him. He specialized in real estate law, and his list of major clients, proudly displayed on the firm's website, included the primary developer who had built Harmony Creek Estates and still owned several undeveloped parcels on its periphery. The pattern was predatory and deeply disturbing. Karen wasn't just a power-tripping bully. She was the tip of the spear for a much larger, more sophisticated operation. She would use the HOA's bylaws to harass and fine residents, targeting those who were elderly, financially vulnerable, or simply too intimidated to fight back. She'd levy fines until they became unpayable, slap a lien on the property, and foreclose. Then her developer friends would swoop in through their shell company, pick up the property for pennies on the dollar, likely flip it for a tidy profit, and Karen would get, what? A finder's fee? A piece of the action? It was a racket. A perfectly legal, monstrously unethical racket. My fence was never the issue. It was a test. I was a new, unknown variable, and she was testing my willingness to comply. If I had caved, I would have been marked as an easy target for future harassment. If I fought back in a predictable, emotional way, she would have buried me in legal fees and procedural nonsense. But she never counted on me fighting back with the cold, hard logic of an investigator. I organized all my findings into a thick binder, complete with copies of contracts, property records, and corporate filings. I created timelines and flowcharts connecting Karen Miller to her brother-in-law's company and to the Evergreen Development Group. The binder felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the quiet misery of the people she had targeted. This was no longer about my $50,000 fine. It was about dismantling a corrupt system that was preying on an entire community. My personal battle had just become a crusade. And for that, I would need an army. An army needs soldiers, and a crusade needs believers. I knew I couldn't fight this alone, not if I wanted to create lasting change for the entire community. A solo lawsuit might solve my problem, but it wouldn't stop the rot. It was time to bring my intelligence reports to the people who were living under the occupation. I decided against a formal meeting. That felt too much like what Karen would do. Instead, I planned a classic community-building event, a weekend barbecue. I printed simple, friendly flyers and, with General trotting happily beside me, I walked the neighborhood, placing one in every mailbox. Getting to know the neighbors. Join Marcus Thorne for a casual barbecue. Burgers, hot dogs, and good conversation. Saturday at 2 p.m. 1120 Old Farm Road. I made a special point of hand-delivering invitations to Mrs. Gable and the Garcia couple, telling them quietly that I had something important to discuss regarding the HOA and that they weren't alone. On Saturday, the weather was perfect. I had my large grill going, the smell of sizzling burgers in the air. My daughter, Sarah, and her 2 kids came over to help, their presence lending a warm, family-friendly atmosphere to the gathering. At first, people were hesitant. They trickled in one by one, grabbing a plate of food and standing in small, quiet groups. They were curious but cautious. They had been conditioned to be wary of their neighbors, to fear that any complaint might get back to Karen. I let them eat and mingle for a while, making my way through the crowd with a beer in hand, just chatting. I talked about my time in the service, asked about their kids, their jobs. I was just a retired guy, a new neighbor. Slowly, the atmosphere began to relax. Once about 30 people had gathered in my backyard, a significant portion of the community. I shut off the grill and stood on my back deck. "Hey, everyone," I started, my voice carrying easily in the afternoon air. "Thanks so much for coming. I know I'm the new guy on the block, and I really appreciate you all making me feel welcome." I paused, letting the friendly opening settle. "I invited you all here for 2 reasons. First, to share some good food. Second, to share some information." I gestured to a large corkboard I had set up, which was covered by a sheet. "I think it's fair to say that many of us have had challenging interactions with our HOA." A wave of nervous laughter and knowing glances rippled through the crowd. "We're told it's all for the good of the community, to protect our property values. But I've been doing some research, and I'm concerned that it's become something else entirely. Something that hurts, rather than helps, the people who live here." With a bit of dramatic flair, I pulled the sheet off the corkboard. Pinned to it were the flowcharts I had created. One showed the clear line from HOA fines to the contracts awarded to Miller's pristine lawns. The other showed the path from HOA liens to foreclosures to the Evergreen Development Group. I used simple, clear visuals, names, dates, and dollar amounts. I walked them through it, step by step, my voice calm and factual. I didn't use inflammatory language. I just presented the evidence. "This isn't just about my fence, or Mrs. Gable's roses, or the Garcias playset," I said, my voice hardening slightly. "This is a pattern. It's a system designed to generate revenue and acquire property under the guise of enforcing community rules. It is predatory, it is unethical, and I believe it is illegal." The silence in the backyard was absolute. People were staring at the board, their expressions shifting from caution to shock, and then to a slow-burning anger. I saw Mr. Garcia put a protective arm around his wife. Mrs. Gable had tears welling in her eyes. I had given them the language and the evidence for a truth they had long felt but couldn't prove. "So what do we do?" a man from the back called out. "She has all the power." "No, she doesn't," I countered, my voice ringing with conviction. "The power of an HOA comes from the homeowners themselves. You are the association. The board works for you, not the other way around. We have the power of the law, the power of public record, and the power of collective action." I laid out my plan. We would form an official committee, the Harmony Creek Homeowners' Rights Committee. We would document every single instance of harassment, selective enforcement, and financial abuse. We would pool our resources to hire a single law firm, Dave Sterling's, though I didn't name him yet, to represent all of us. We would formally demand a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances, as was our right under state law. And we would begin the process of a recall vote for the entire board. It was a declaration of war. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Gable, all 5 feet of her, stepped forward. "She told me my husband's roses were a menace," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I'll join. I'll do whatever it takes." That broke the dam. One by one, people came forward. The Garcias, a family who had been fined for a basketball hoop. A man who'd been forced to repaint his entire house because the trim was an unapproved shade of white by the end of the afternoon. I had a list of 25 families who were officially on board. We had an army. We had a mission. We spent the rest of the day sharing stories, compiling evidence, and for the first time in a long time, feeling a sense of hope. As the sun set, casting long shadows across my yard, I looked at my fence. It was no longer just my fence. It was the rallying point for a rebellion. And Karen Miller had no idea that the very people she'd spent years terrorizing were now organizing in her shadow, preparing to take their community back. The weeks following the barbecue were a blur of controlled, strategic activity. The Harmony Creek Homeowners' Rights Committee was no longer just an idea. It was a functioning organization. We elected a steering committee. I tactfully declined the leadership role, preferring to act as a strategic advisor, set up a private group chat to share information securely, and began a systematic campaign of documentation. My living room became our headquarters. Affidavits were drafted and notarized. Every threatening letter, every unjust fine, every story of harassment was recorded with dates, times, and photographic evidence. The binder I had started for my own case grew into a heavy box, and then two. It was a library of Karen Miller's abuses. Meanwhile, the official notices from the HOA kept coming to my mailbox like clockwork. The fine for my fence had escalated. $8,000, then $16,000, then $32,000. Each letter was more threatening than the last, the language growing more desperate. They were trying to intimidate me into breaking. I filed each one meticulously in my binder. They were just more ammunition. My lawyer, Dave, was now officially retained by the committee. He drafted a formidable cease and desist letter on behalf of the 25 families, demanding the HOA halt all fine collections and harassment pending a legal review. He also sent a formal, legally binding request for a complete financial audit by an independent accounting firm chosen by the committee, citing the same state statutes I had brought up in the farcical hearing. We sent it to the HOA board via courier, ensuring a verifiable chain of custody. Karen's response was predictable. Through the HOA's lawyer, a slick operator from a downtown firm, they rejected all our demands. They called our committee an illegitimate group of disgruntled residents and refused the audit. Claiming it was fiscally irresponsible, they were circling the wagons, preparing for a siege. And then came the letter I had been waiting for. It was from the HOA's law firm, addressed to me personally. It was a formal notice of their intent to file a lien on my property for the now maxed-out fine of $50,000, plus accrued legal fees. This was her final, fatal overreach. This was the trigger. "She did it, Dave," I said over the phone, holding the letter. "She's actually going through with the lien." "Then it's time," Dave replied, his voice grim but excited. "We've got everything we need. The affidavits, the financial red flags, the recording of your hearing, and now this. This is the imminent harm we needed to get an injunction." For the next 48 hours, Dave and I worked around the clock. We assembled our mountain of evidence into a comprehensive, ironclad civil complaint. We weren't just defending against a lien, we were going on the offensive. The lawsuit named the Harmony Creek Estates HOA as the primary defendant. But we also named Karen Miller, Sheila, and Barry personally as co-defendants, piercing the corporate veil to hold them directly accountable for their actions. This was critical. It meant their personal assets were now at risk, not just the HOA's insurance policy. The suit alleged a stunning list of grievances: breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to commit fraud, violations of the State Property Owners Association Act, selective enforcement, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We attached dozens of exhibits: the notarized affidavits, the corporate records for Miller's Landscaping and Evergreen Development, the recording of my hearing, and a full accounting of the fines levied against the committee members. We filed for an immediate injunction to halt the lien on my property and all other collection activities. We demanded compensatory and punitive damages. And most importantly, we petitioned the court to appoint a third-party receiver to take control of the HOA's finances and operations pending the outcome of the lawsuit, based on the overwhelming evidence of mismanagement and potential fraud. We filed the lawsuit electronically with the county court late on a Thursday afternoon. It was a declaration of total war, a legal bombshell dropped directly onto Karen Miller's perfectly manicured kingdom. She would be served within a day. She would wake up tomorrow morning a defendant not just in a case about a fence, but in a massive racketeering lawsuit that threatened to destroy her reputation, her finances, and her power base completely. But I had one more ace up my sleeve. Something Karen couldn't possibly see coming. As I sat at my desk, the filed confirmation from the court glowing on my screen, I thought about the nature of power. Karen thought power came from a title, a gavel, and the ability to intimidate. She was about to learn that true power, the kind that endures, comes from the quiet, methodical application of rules, law, and process. the very things she had so arrogantly ignored. The lawsuit was the public face of my counterattack. The private one was about to land on my own desk. The universe has a funny way of delivering irony right to your doorstep, sometimes in a manila envelope carried by a county courier. The morning after we filed the lawsuit, a stack of permit applications landed in my judicial inbox for my weekly review. I was the county judge assigned to the land use and planning docket, a position that handled everything from zoning variances to major development permits. It was usually dry, procedural work, but it was a critical choke point in the county's growth. No significant building project moved forward without a judge's final sign-off on the permits. As I flipped through the stack, one application made me stop cold. The applicant was Harmony Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The project was a multi-million-dollar expansion of their community facilities. A new Olympic-sized swimming pool, a state-of-the-art fitness center, and a lavishly renovated clubhouse. It was the crown jewel of Karen's reign, a monument to her vision for the community, funded by years of escalating HOA dues and, I now knew, predatory fines. I scanned the documents. They had already cleared the planning department, the environmental review, and the building inspectors. All the bureaucratic boxes had been ticked. The final step was my signature. A single stroke of my pen and they could break ground. Without it, the project was dead in the water, a pile of useless architectural drawings and millions in stalled capital. A slow smile spread across my face. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated, karmic beauty. Karen Miller, the woman who was trying to foreclose on my home over 6 inches of wood, now needed my personal judicial approval to build her legacy project. My first instinct was to simply deny it. A big, satisfying denied stamp right on the front page. But that would have been an abuse of my position, the very thing I was fighting against. My victory had to be clean. It had to be by the book. I buzzed my clerk. Jessica, could you come in here for a moment? Jessica, a sharp, efficient woman who had been with me for years, came in with a notepad. Yes, Judge. I need to formally recuse myself from the review of this permit application, I said, sliding the Harmony Creek packet across my desk. I am a party in a significant civil lawsuit against the applicant. It represents a clear conflict of interest. Of course, Judge Thorne, she said, making a note. I'll reassign it to Judge Albright's docket. Before you do, I added, holding up a hand, I need you to attach a judicial note to the file. Please state that while I am recusing myself, I am flagging this application for a full administrative review by the next judge. The grounds for the review are the extensive legal complaints filed against the applicant's board of directors, which include allegations of financial mismanagement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Note that these pending legal actions may have a material impact on the applicant's financial stability and their ability to responsibly manage a project of this scale. Jessica's eyebrows shot up. She understood the implication immediately. No judge in their right mind would sign off on a multi-million-dollar permit for an organization that was actively being sued by its own members for financial fraud and was under petition to be put into receivership. So, the project is on hold? She asked carefully. The project is frozen, I clarified. Indefinitely, pending the outcome of the litigation and a complete review of the applicant's governing practices and financial health. Make sure a copy of that note is sent to the applicant's legal counsel today. Yes, Judge, she said, a small smile playing on her lips as she took the packet. As she left, I leaned back in my leather chair. I had just, with perfect legal propriety, squeezed the financial lifeblood of Karen's entire operation. The clubhouse expansion was her promise to the community, the justification for the ever-increasing dues. With it stalled, the residents who supported her would start asking questions. The developer who was likely backing the project would get nervous. The pressure on her would become immense, coming not just from our lawsuit, but from her own allies. The lien on my house was a single artillery shell. The lawsuit was a full frontal assault. Freezing her permit was a strategic strike on her supply lines, cutting her off from the very source of her political capital. She had weaponized paperwork against me, and I had just turned the full, crushing weight of the county's entire bureaucratic apparatus back on her. She wouldn't even know it was me. All she would know is that her grand project, her legacy, had suddenly and inexplicably been buried in a mountain of red tape, flagged by a judge for reasons she couldn't argue with. The war was now being fought on two fronts, and she was surrounded. The beauty of it was that I hadn't broken a single rule. I had simply enforced them. The shockwaves from our two-pronged attack hit Harmony Creek almost immediately. On Friday morning, a process server, a big, no-nonsense guy who looked like he wrestled bears for a hobby, walked right up to Karen Miller's front door while she was trimming her prize-winning and HOA-compliant azaleas. He served her with the lawsuit papers in full view of half a dozen neighbors who were out walking their dogs or getting their mail. The public humiliation was the opening salvo. According to witnesses, her face went from its usual smug superiority to ghost-white shock as she read the first page, which listed her name, personally, as a defendant. The news of the lawsuit spread through the community like wildfire. Our private group chat buzzed with messages of relief and excitement. The giant had been struck, and for the first time it looked vulnerable. Simultaneously, the HOA's lawyer received the notification from the county courthouse that their clubhouse permit was frozen. I could only imagine the frantic, furious phone call that took place between him and Karen. She was being attacked from a direction she couldn't even comprehend. The pressure was building, and it was about to go public. I received a call on Monday from a reporter at the local TV news station, a young, ambitious journalist named Sarah Jenkins. "Mr. Thorne," she began, "I'm holding a copy of a rather explosive lawsuit filed against the Harmony Creek HOA. It lists you as one of the primary plaintiffs. My editor is very interested in stories about HOA overreach. Would you be willing to speak with me?" This was the moment to turn our private war into a public execution. "I would," I said calmly. "But I'm not the only one you should talk to. The story isn't just about me. It's about an entire community. I can put you in touch with several other families who have been affected." I arranged for the reporter to meet with our committee at Mrs. Gable's house. I made sure to frame my own involvement carefully, presenting myself as a retired Army colonel and concerned community member. My judicial position was irrelevant to the public narrative and would only complicate things. The real power of the story lay with the everyday people Karen had victimized. The interview was powerful. Mrs. Gable, sitting in her living room, spoke with heartbreaking dignity about her husband's roses. The Garcias talked about the stress and financial hardship of fighting over the color of a child's toy. One by one, my neighbors told their stories, their voices filled with a newfound strength. I provided the reporter with the non-confidential parts of our evidence: the corporate filings linking Karen to her brother-in-law's company, the public records of the foreclosures, and the suspicious purchases by Evergreen Development Group. I gave her a clear, evidence-backed narrative of systemic abuse. The story aired on the 6 o'clock news that Wednesday. It was the lead segment. It opened with a shot of my sturdy cedar fence, then cut to an interview with a visibly flustered Karen Miller, whom the reporter had ambushed in the clubhouse parking lot. "These are baseless allegations from a few troublemakers who don't want to follow the rules," Karen stammered, clutching her purse like a shield. "Our HOA is dedicated to maintaining property values and community harmony." The reporter then coolly presented her with the evidence of the contracts awarded to her brother-in-law's company. Karen's face crumbled on camera. That's just good business," she sputtered. "He does good work." It was a public relations disaster of epic proportions. The story was devastating. It painted Karen not as a diligent community leader, but as a corrupt tyrant profiting from the suffering of her neighbors. The news station's switchboard lit up. The story was shared thousands of times on social media. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict, and it was a guillotine for Karen's reputation. The segment also included a key detail: a mention that the HOA's ambitious, multimillion-dollar clubhouse expansion had been indefinitely stalled by the county over concerns about the association's financial management. This detail, which I had subtly fed to the reporter, was a dagger for Karen's remaining supporters. Now their dues were being spent on a massive lawsuit, and the project they were promised was dead. The blowback within the community was immediate. People who had once defended Karen were now demanding answers. The HOA's official Facebook page was flooded with angry comments. The thin veneer of Harmony Creek had been stripped away, revealing the ugly reality beneath. The final piece of the public pressure puzzle fell into place 2 days later. I received a call from an investigator at the State Attorney General's office. The news report had caught their attention. "Mr. Thorne," the investigator said, "we're opening a formal inquiry into the business practices of the Harmony Creek Estates HOA based on the allegations of fraud and self-dealing. We'd be very interested in reviewing the evidence your committee has compiled." I felt a wave of profound satisfaction. It was out of my hands now. The wheels of state-level justice were beginning to turn. Karen Miller had started a war over a 6-foot fence. Now she was facing a class action lawsuit, a community in open revolt, a stalled legacy project, and a full-blown investigation by the state attorney general. Her petty kingdom was burning down around her, and she was the one who had lit the match. The fallout from the news story was swift and brutal. Karen Miller, who had thrived on control and public image, found herself completely isolated. The 2 other board members, Sheila and Barry, were in full-blown panic mode. Their names had been mentioned in the report, and they were co-defendants in a lawsuit that now had the attention of the state. Their instinct for self-preservation finally overrode their loyalty to their queen. Dave Sterling received a call from a lawyer representing Sheila and Barry. They wanted to cut a deal. They were willing to provide testimony against Karen in exchange for being dropped from the personal liability portion of the lawsuit. Dave and I conferred. We agreed. They were pawns, not the architects of the scheme. Their testimony would be the final nail in Karen's coffin. We scheduled a special community meeting, as was our right under the bylaws, provided we had a petition signed by at least 20% of the homeowners. We got signatures from over 60% in a single evening. The purpose of the meeting was simple and stated clearly on the notice we posted throughout the community. A vote of no confidence and a motion to recall the entire HOA board. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. It was standing room only. The atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. This wasn't the cowed, miserable group I had seen at my sham hearing. This was an engaged, angry, and empowered citizenry, ready to take back their community. I sat with Mrs. Gable and the Garcias in the front row. We were a united front. Karen, Sheila, and Barry took their seats at the folding table at the front of the room. But the dynamic was completely changed. They weren't judges on a tribunal anymore. They were defendants in the dock. Karen, looking pale and drawn but still defiant, tried to seize control from the start. "I'd like to call this emergency meeting to order," she began, her voice tight. "There have been a lot of vicious rumors and baseless accusations." She was cut off by Mr. Garcia, who stood up from his seat. "We're not here to listen to your excuses, Karen," he shouted, his voice echoing in the packed room. "We're here to remove you." A chorus of "yeah" and "resign" erupted from the crowd. Karen banged her cheap gavel, but the noise drowned it out. "This meeting is out of order," she shrieked, her composure finally shattering. "I am the president." "Not for long," I said, standing up. My voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. The room quieted, all eyes turning to me. According to Article 3, Section 4 of the bylaws, a special meeting can be called by the members to vote on the removal of any and all board members. We have followed the procedure to the letter. This meeting is perfectly in order. We will now proceed with the vote. I looked to Sheila and Barry. "Do either of you have anything to say before the vote is called?" Barry, the nervous man, looked like he was about to be physically ill. He shook his head, staring at the table. Sheila, however, stood up. Her face was grim. I just want to say that I was not aware of the full extent of the financial irregularities," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I was misled. For that, I apologize to the community, and I will be tendering my resignation from the board." Effective immediately, she sat down, refusing to look at Karen. A moment later, Barry mumbled, "Me too," without even looking up. It was a complete mutiny. Karen was left alone at the table, her allies having abandoned her on the sinking ship. Her face was a mask of pure, undiluted fury and betrayal. "Fine," she spat into the microphone. "Go ahead. Have your vote. See what good it does you when this entire community goes down the drain without my leadership." The vote was a formality. A sea of hands went up in favor of her removal. When the call came for votes against, not a single hand was raised. It was unanimous. Karen Miller was officially, and humiliatingly, removed from power. She sat there for a long moment, stunned into silence, as the reality of her defeat washed over her. Then, with a strangled cry of rage, she swept her papers off the table, knocked over the water pitcher, and stormed out of the clubhouse to a chorus of jeers and sarcastic applause. We had done it. The tyrant was deposed. In the aftermath, we elected an interim board, with Mrs. Gable reluctantly but bravely agreeing to serve as the new president. Her first act was to vote to drop the fine against me and nullify every other punitive fine levied under Karen's reign. Our lawsuit proceeded. Faced with testimony from her former board members and the evidence from the Attorney General's investigation, the HOA's insurance company quickly sought a settlement. The terms were a complete victory for us. The HOA officially admitted wrongdoing. All of the committee members who had paid unjust fines were fully reimbursed with interest. The contract with Miller's Pristine Lawns was terminated, and the settlement money included a significant sum to be paid directly by Karen Miller from her personal assets for her breach of fiduciary duty. She was forced to sell her house to cover the legal fees and the judgment. The last I saw of her, she was packing her belongings into a U-Haul, her face a permanent scowl. The Evergreen Development Group quietly dissolved its shell corporation and abandoned its predatory ambitions in our neighborhood. The state's investigation led to new regulations being proposed at the legislative level to protect homeowners from these kinds of predatory HOA practices. Our small fight had sparked a statewide change. It was a total, comprehensive victory, not just for me, but for the entire community of Harmony Creek. Justice, it turned out, was a dish best served via certified mail, public exposure, and an ironclad legal case. In the months that followed the Great HOA Rebellion, a quiet but profound transformation took place in Harmony Creek Estates. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and suspicion lifted like a morning fog. Under Mrs. Gable's gentle but firm leadership, the new board went to work, not as rulers but as caretakers. Their first order of business was a complete overhaul of the covenants. I served as an advisor to the committee, helping them redraft the bylaws to be fair, clear, and focused on genuine community well-being rather than punitive control. We kept the rules that genuinely protected property values, things like basic lawn maintenance and keeping properties in good repair, but we stripped out all the petty, tyrannical nonsense. The approved color palette for houses was replaced with a simple guideline encouraging harmonious and well-maintained exteriors. The section on holiday decorations was reduced to a single sentence about safety and public nuisance. The infamous flora list was ceremoniously shredded. In its place, the board started a community garden on one of the greenbelts. The changes were more than just cosmetic. The new board established a transparent and fair process for handling disputes, with an emphasis on neighborly mediation rather than instant fines. They published the HOA's budget online for all to see. The contracts for community services were put out for competitive bidding, saving the homeowners a significant amount of money. People started talking to each other again. Kids' brightly colored playsets reappeared in backyards. Mrs. Gable, with the help of a dozen neighbors, replanted her husband's rose garden, and it became a point of pride for the entire street. The Garcias hosted a neighborhood potluck to celebrate paying off the predatory loan they'd been forced to take out. The community that Karen Miller had tried to control through division and fear was now healing itself through cooperation and trust. The stalled clubhouse and pool project was eventually revisited. With clean books and a responsible board, a new, more modest and fiscally sound plan was drawn up. When the permit application came across my desk again a year later, I was able to sign it without hesitation. I attended the groundbreaking ceremony not as a judge, but as a neighbor, another face in the happy crowd. No one there, apart from Dave Sterling and my family, ever knew the full extent of my role in the drama or the judicial power I had quietly wielded from behind the scenes. And that was just fine with me. I hadn't fought this battle for recognition. I had fought it for peace, for my peace, and for the peace of my neighbors. My victory wasn't about humiliating Karen or proving a point. It was about restoring the simple principle that a home should be a sanctuary, not a battleground. One evening, not long after, I was sitting on my back deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. My daughter Sarah and my grandkids were over, their laughter echoing in the yard as they threw a ball for General. The German Shepherd, the unwitting catalyst for the whole affair, bounded across the grass, happy and secure. I looked at my cedar fence. Its wood now weathered to a handsome silver gray. It stood strong and straight, a quiet testament to the fight we had won. It was no longer a symbol of defiance, but a simple, honest boundary marking the edge of my own private piece of the world, a world where fairness had prevailed, a world where a community had remembered that harmony isn't about forced conformity, but about the respect people show one another. The fine was gone, the tyrant was gone, and the peace I had moved here to find had finally been secured. And it was sweeter for having been fought for.